hate math a lot more than they hate pretty much any other subject at school. Like the number one terrible class that people don't want to go to. Math. No, not math. Ah! You know, have you noticed that too? And then there's that thing where people are so proud that they never learned math. Like, oh, I never learned math. I don't need to know math. There's no point in math. Look at me. All that math in school was a waste of time. That thing. There's an article in the Harvard Gazette which quotes Brendan Kelly, the director of introductory math at Harvard, saying, I'm going to read it to you so I don't get it wrong, saying, there's a genius myth in mathematics. There's often this perception that success requires some natural ability, some unteachable qualities, some immutable traits. Which is to say that most of us are convinced that either you have the math genius or you don't have it. But I have a theory. People who think they are not math people, do not have the math genius, have never learned how to study math. Which means there's nothing wrong with math, there's nothing wrong with you, but until you learn those study skills, math is gonna feel like witchcraft. And that's difficult to learn. Luckily, the process for studying math is actually pretty straightforward. There are 4 steps that you need to do. The first step is to learn which theorems, equations, and methods you are going to need to know. The second step is to learn how to use those theorems, equations, and methods. The third step is to learn how to see which one you should use in each case and for each problem. And the fourth step is to practice. Just practice until you feel confident. In the first step, which is finding your equations, methods, and theorems that you're going to need to use, you need to know where to look. So the first place you're going to want to look is in your textbook, if your course has a textbook. You should look through the chapter that you're doing, and the equations, methods, and theorems that you need will most likely be in a little box, or they will be kind of set aside from the rest of the text in bold. And then if you don't have a textbook, you want to look in your lecture slides, lecture notes, anything you have access to from during class that'll tell you what you went over in class. And if you don't have those, or if you want to be even more thorough, you can look through all of your homework or practice problems and decide which theorem, equation, or method you needed to use to solve each problem. For instance, if I needed to take a test on how to factor any polynomial, and I didn't have a textbook for my class, but I knew that it could be factoring anything, what I might do is look through each of my problems and see which method I had to use for each problem until I have a list of every single method I might need to use. So I might look through and go, okay, so in this problem, I had to use factor by grouping. So I'm gonna write factor by grouping on my list. In this problem, I had to use, I ended up having to use the quadratic formula. So I'm gonna write quadratic formula on my list until I have a list of every single factoring method that I have learned and that I might need to know for my test. In step 2, it's important that you know how to use or how to do each method, equation, or theorem. So the first place you probably want to look is in your textbook or in your lecture notes. Those are going to be the places that tell you what your teacher or professor is expecting you to do, especially your lecture notes, but your textbook might have more examples or more practice problems for each type of theorem, equation, or method. But if you don't have access to a textbook, or if you don't have good lecture notes, or if your textbook or your lecture notes are not feeling clear to you, you can search each of your equations, methods, or theorems in Google and find articles or videos that are going to explain how to do it. The important thing is that you write down on your paper an explanation of each equation, method, or theorem that you need to know that makes sense to you. So based on just the explanation you've written down, if you totally forget it in like 6 months, you'd be able to look at it and go, oh yeah, that's what I do. So the important thing is that what you've written down makes a lot of sense to you. Step 3, which is the step that usually trips people up and makes people feel like there are math people and not math people. You are looking at every single equation, theorem, or method that you have written down on your paper, and you are deciding which ones you use when, how you're going to use them. So what you need to do is go, okay, so for instance, if you're looking at factor by grouping, when can you factor by grouping? You can factor by grouping when you have more than 3 terms, and when you pull something out of each set of 2 terms, you have the same thing left over. So it's something you're going to use when you have more than 3 terms, but then it might not always work. So you're going to note that next to it and go through and note for each method, equation, or theorem what it's good for, when you would use it. Once you have noted for each equation, method, and theorem, then you're going to try to draw a flowchart. So what you want to do is you want to draw, if I start at the very top of this, which questions do I need to ask myself and in which order until I get all the way through the problem, so that I cover every single thing that I need to look at before I get to the end. And once you finish step 3, once you've drawn your flowchart, all that's left for you to do is to practice. So you're going to use your flowchart while you're practicing to help you decide which equation, theorem, or method you're going to use for each problem. But most likely, during the act of making the flowchart, you've learned a lot of what you need to know. So you're probably not going to need to look at it too much. And by the time you're done practicing, it'll probably be pretty solidly stuck in your head, which is what we want. So you practice until you feel good. You practice until you're like, yeah, I got this in the bag. And finally, I would like to say that if you find yourself stressing, panicking, staring at the paper, going, I don't know what this is or how this works or what to do, it's time to take a break. So you should go outside, you should look at the sky, you should touch some grass, you should drink some water, you should lay on the floor and stare at the ceiling, anything except for doing math for like 10 to 15 minutes. Just reset your brain and then come back, go back into your flowchart, go back into your notes that you've made, and I promise you will figure out how to do it. You're gonna be okay. It's gonna be okay. Math is not gonna ruin your life, I promise. Okay, bye.